Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Earth Day Live today. My name is Tom Cosgrove, Chief Creative and Content Officer at earthday.org. The theme for Earth Day this year is Invest in Our Planet, focused on engaging governments, institutions, businesses, and the more than 1 billion citizens who participate annually in Earth Day. Invest in Our Planet calls on all sectors to do their part. Everyone accounted for, everyone accountable. In today's panel, you'll learn more about the relationship between banks and climate, what you can do to fight climate change, and why your choice of bank is one of the biggest environmental decisions you'll make. Now, without further ado, I want to thank our partner, Deborah Moore from Third Act, who will be the host of today's panel. She'll introduce the panelists, and if we have time at the end, the panelists will be taking questions from you, the audience. So please do send your questions in. Thank you, Deborah, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with earthday.org and such an important event, over 50 years of Earth Day activities. So really happy to be here to make these connections. And yeah, we're going to talk about banks and climate change today and how they are bankrolling the climate crisis. So just a quick overview of our panel members. We've got the person who probably needs no introduction, Bill McKibben, a renowned author and founder of Third Act. You'll hear about Third Act, which is kind of a new organization, in a minute. We're working on climate and racial justice and democracy. He also founded 350.org and is a distinguished professor in residence at Middlebury College in Vermont, where there's tons of snow right now. He's won lots of awards and has a book out this year called The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. Great title. We also have Vanessa Fajans-Turner, and she describes herself as a climate nerd and ocean tech enthusiast. She's the executive director of Bank Forward, focused on driving meaningful, actual, measurable climate action throughout the banking sector, and also is a founding principal with Investable Oceans, and she's in also on the East Coast. And we have Russell Armstrong, the policy director for climate and environment at the Hip Hop Caucus. And he works on federal policy that provides climate justice and environmental justice for marginalized communities most impacted by climate change and institutional racism. And he also was a senior policy advisor for Oxfam and worked for Green for All, and is an attorney who worked for the Department of Justice. So we've got a great team today. And so we're going to start. This is just going to be conversational. We've got some videos. You're going to learn all kinds of things about what you can do to make a difference today. In particular, we've got this National Day of Action to Stop Dirty Banks coming up on March 21st, next week. So you're going to hear about how to get involved with that, as well as other things you can do to make a difference. So with that, I'm going to ask Bill to join us here. And Bill, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about why did you start Third Act? What is this about? And we're also going to show a short video that describes Third Act. But tell us a little bit about.
Sure. Well, first of all, what a pleasure to be with you, Deborah. What a pleasure to be with Russell and Vanessa. And this could not be a more important topic, especially right now with banks in the news and everything happening around us, and a few days out from this big day of action, which is going to have 90 or 100 demonstrations all across America taking on the big banks. And some of the people in those demonstrations won't look exactly like you expect. We're used to the idea that the climate movement is a youthful affair, which indeed it is. We all know its heroes, Greta Thunberg, and the incredible people from the Sunrise Movement, and on and on and on. But happily, they're getting a little bit of backup from old people like me now. We started Third Act about a year ago. And the premise was that there are 70 million Americans over the age of 60. They have outsized political power because they participate. There is no known way to stop old people from voting. And they have most of the country's financial resources too. So when we're talking about pressuring Washington or Wall Street, it's useful to have some people with hairlines like mine engaged in this work. And so it has been. In its first year, Third Act has been able to do all sorts of things aimed at stopping racialized voter suppression, aimed at registering and turning out voters, and aimed at taking on the climate crisis. We want to protect democracy. We want to protect the climate. We want to protect the climate and the political climate, you might say, because they both seem to us to be under great, great threat. And at the moment, what we're leaning into hard in March of 2023 is taking on the biggest pools of capital in the world, the biggest banks on the planet, because they're also the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. And it's particularly useful for older people to be doing this, not only because, as I said, we have a lot of the resources that are in those banks, but because this is about not just the future for young people and what they're going to have to live with, though that's the biggest reason to be engaged here, trying to protect young people and vulnerable and frontline communities. But it's also about legacy and about the world that we're leaving behind at some point. So that's why we do what we do at Third Act. We have tens and tens of thousands of volunteers and chapters all across the country. So tell your grandparents, let them know that there is a place to take their good hopes for their grandkids and for their world and to make them very real.
That is a great introduction. I think you did such a great job that we actually won't show the video right now. We do have some other videos to show later, but to get your grandparents or parents involved, thirdact.org is where you can go to join. And I think let's bring Vanessa on, and we'll just dive right in for Bill and Vanessa to chat together about how banks are related to climate and how your cash equals carbon. So I'm going to let you two take it away, and we do have some slides that Sophia will help show at the right moment.
Well, let me lead off here, because Vanessa's a really important person in this climate fight. And she's important because she's done extraordinary work with her colleagues over the last 18 months or so to demonstrate to us just how central the money coming out of our banking system is to propping up the fossil fuel industry. We're, many of us are kind of reeling this week because it looks like there's going to be yet another huge oil development up in Alaska by ConocoPhillips, who have taken tens of billions of dollars in loans from the four banks, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that we've been targeting here. And it's just one more good example of this ongoing drama. So Vanessa, walk us through, you've got the slides to do us, walk us through an understanding of how cash equals carbon. It's easy to understand why Exxon's a problem. They dig stuff up and set it on fire, and that's what causes global warming. It's a tiny bit harder to understand why Citibank is a problem. But what it boils down to is they hand the money to Exxon to dig the stuff up to set on fire. So take us from there.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Bill and Deborah, and to the whole earthday.org network. It's always a pleasure to be online with you and with Russell. This is an important conversation to have with this group of partners. And at this moment, I think to start with, it's really important to understand that our money has power in all sorts of ways. And that can sound odd when we talk about banks, but think about how we think about our dollars in other parts of our life. We use our dollars to donate to organizations like Third Act, on a regular basis. We understand our money has powers in those ways. We understand, and we've heard people talk in ways about divestment and impact investment. We understand that where we put our money makes a difference in key ways when we invest. We don't think about where we put our money passively, where our money sleeps, to put it that way, as something that has a positive or negative or any value assigned to it. But in fact, it is the most important and impactful way that our money impacts the world around us, and specifically our climate. I'll say that again. Our deposits in our banks are actually value positive or value negative actions we take with our money. And that's because banks that are giving money to fossil fuel companies are doing so usually through loans or through underwriting. And to do that, they use money that is deposited in their bank to back up those loans as collateral, as actual direct finance. And we don't recognize that that's what's happening because it's not necessary that banks tell us where our specific dollars are used. But here's what our research has shown. One in every $24 on average on Wall Street, 24 in every $100. So 24% of all money put in banks that banks lend goes to fossil fuels. Banks don't lend 100% of money that is deposited out. That's what capital requirements are for, but they lend a lot of it, sometimes 90%. So that means of that money they lend out, 24% is going to fossil fuels, which could mean that up to 24, almost a quarter of the money you're depositing is actually going to fossil fuels, even though you're not doing anything with it. You're accruing interest, but that interest is coming because loans made with it to fossil fuel companies are paying that interest back to the bank. It can be a little confusing. So if you look at the image on the screen, this is talking about companies or what individuals do. They give their money to a bank. Banks use that money for their own business. And that's how this chain goes. So if you think about what you do with your money, not all banks are created equal. Wall Street banks are the largest funders of fossil fuels in the world. The top banks that Third Act is targeting, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America in order of the largest financiers of fossil fuels last year, are much more likely to give your money to fossil fuels than they are banks that are much smaller. So we can stop there, but that's where bank choice is, in fact, the most impactful thing in many aspects of life that we can do to impact the climate.
Well, and you have some numbers to tell us exactly how impactful. Like, this is not a small marginal secondary impact. This could be as big as all the flying and heating and driving and cooking and whatever that people are doing in the course of a year.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, if you put your money in basically a fossil fuel free bank, and then you move it to one of the biggest Wall Street banks, your emissions from every dollar will increase 174%. That's going from a bank that is small, like the bank where I bank, Amalgamated, to a bank on Wall Street, one of the JP Morgan Chase, Citibanks, et cetera. That's a 174 increase on every dollar in terms of the emissions that you finance. And that change alone is the equivalent in terms of percentage, is going to significantly compare with your flights. So if you have, say, $25,000 in the bank, you can, or we can say, if you have $5,000 in the bank, your money is generating as many emissions as depending on where you're banking. But if you're on Wall Street, your $5,000 is generating, I don't know if we have the video. If we can go to the next screen or the next slide, you will see that we have a calculator where everyone can do this for themselves. And $5,000 will be the equivalent of almost 900 pounds of coal. It is 2 cross-country flights and 2,000 miles driven in a gasoline-powered car. What's really important to think about then is that if that $5,000 stays in that account and your bank does not change its habits at all, then your money will continue to accrue, and over the years, this financing continues. So this cycle continues. This is not a one-off equivalency. This money continues to finance activities in fossil fuels in an ongoing fashion. So what's really significant is that every additional dollar you place in the bank is increasing emissions in the world, even as we are in the world doing things like flying, like choosing to eat all sorts of foods with different footprints. We don't stop our lives just because our money is in the bank. But if we want to be able to continue and balance our carbon footprint, we have to be aware of our money as a key part of that footprint.
Right. And of course, our goal in the end is not to purify our own particular lives. Our goal in the end is actually to slow down global warming. And so we'd love nothing more than to have these big banks start to change what they do. And that's really the focus of most of our efforts, to get them to come to a new place and a new understanding. Not, it must be said, telling them that they can no longer have anything to do with the fossil fuel industry. We're going to be using oil and gas, sadly, for a few more years on this planet. And so, Exxon needs a bank. But what we've been asking in the course of all these fights is for them to stop funding the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, which is the lowest of all possible targets, but the one that scientist after scientist has said is absolutely necessary to meet any of the climate targets that we've set. And the good news is that some big banks are starting to come around. We saw in December that HSBC, the biggest bank in Europe by assets, announced that they were no longer going to be bankrolling new oil and gas fields. That's after many years of public outcry and protest, and it's a good sign as to what we're trying to do globally here. So enormously important work that you've been up to, Vanessa.
Thank you. We're excited to share and support your day of action on Monday.
Tuesday. It's on Tuesday.
I'm so sorry. Day of action on Tuesday, of course. Day ahead.
You can get an early start, Vanessa. That's
right. I'm going to be sitting out in front of the bank on Monday. We want everybody to calculate a bit of their own footprint on the Third Act website. And as Bill says, the goal is to have your bank change its behavior. So let them know that you care about that. And if anybody out there is looking for a new bank in light of the terrible collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and others, this is a moment to consider the difference in impact our money can make, and to send a big market signal to banks that climate and their support of fossil fuels matters to you as a client. Thank you.
And that is the perfect segue and lead in to Russell from Hip Hop Caucus. Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you, Bill. That they were just talking about why we need to divest, but we also need to talk about how we're going to invest and what does that look like. But before we get exactly to that invest part of the equation, Russell, tell us a bit about Hip Hop Caucus, how you use culture to mobilize and engage people and change the world for the better, and how you got involved. And then we'll talk a bit about what you all do.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you all again, as we're a partner with Third Act, and happy to working with you all. So I am the Climate and Policy Environment Director for the Hip Hop Caucus. Our work has extended long before I got here. The Hip Hop Caucus started out in 2004, working on issues related to voting rights and democracy. It actually stemmed out of a couple different organizations, one being the Hip Hop Summit, and another being that our president and CEO, Rev Yearwood, was a partner with Diddy on, many remember, the Vote or Die campaign. And so that was a focus on democracy and voting rights, which are actually connected to environmental justice, but I'll get to that specifically in a second. Moving on, our work in environmental justice began a year later, after 2004 and 2005, stemming out of the crisis from Hurricane Katrina, and just seeing the impact of what a lack of planning and a lack of support can do for folks on the ground. And therefore, we pivoted, and Rev Yearwood helped start the Think 100% platform, which spanned into the Coolest Show podcast, which is folks look into. And so that work has rolled on as we're now involved in economic justice, voting rights and democracy, and also into environmental justice. And we don't see those things as being disconnected, but actually being well interwoven together. You can't have one without the other. And so
Russell, can I just interrupt for 1 second just to tell people there really is no more effective group in this whole all this work than Hip Hop Caucus. And Rev Yearwood, who's one of my oldest and dearest friends, has led the way. Every single fight that we've been in, there he's been at the forefront time and time and time again, and not just at the forefront, in the jail cell too. So the Hip Hop Caucus is absolutely central to, and just so many thanks to you for continuing this incredibly important work.
No, thanks for that, Bill. I'm glad you jumped in with that, because mentioning your long relationship with Rev Yearwood, of course, since in partnering on this work. And getting back, I wanted to, Deb, get to your original question about how we're working in divestment and investment. Going back to the days of, honestly, slavery days and coming out of that, Black Americans have been forced to kind of been, one, not involved in, basically kept out of the banking system and the financial system. And two, we've had to find ways to get around that by either hiding our own money or creating alternative pathways for investment, because, just with we were denied access to housing, denied access to jobs, denied access to higher education, and denied access to credit. And so all of these things have culminated in a lack of investment in the communities that you expect. The redlining and Jim Crow South era led to a lack of safety, in addition to the lack of investment, education, et cetera, in these places and spaces. And so that history has seen where we have a well-known racial wealth divide, where white Americans are 10 times more wealthier than Black Americans. Black Americans, even though are wealthier more time now than they ever have been in history, are still closer to poverty in their counterparts than other demographic groups. Our lack of access, and there's still racist lending problems that happen, particularly from the large banks like Bank of America and others, and Wells Fargo, that have been well documented. And so the history of Black banks, and they make up there are 18 Black-owned banks in the U.S. versus hundreds of thousands of investment places that are non-Black owned. And that stems from, terrorist actions such as the Tulsa riots that happened, where folks may know it as Black Wall Street, where folks were terrorized, burning down the city to keep investment from happening, or in places like Durham, North Carolina, where the Black community basically had to find an end around of, from being, terrorized and hiding their money, essentially, and keeping wealth outside of the normal stream of financing. And so you see that happening again, where, the issue of slavery leads to land use being throughout the South being industrialized, and that land never gets passed on to the people who actually work the land. and therefore you don't have access to land rights. You see fossil fuel companies move in after that land gets moved around from generation to generation. They're able to get credit and insurance to build out massive facilities in these areas that end up polluting the people who families used to work as tenants, sharecroppers in those areas, and are still living in there and still getting subjected to the legacy horrors from that their families had to deal with in the form of pollution and the lack of access to credit and insurance. And so now, with one of the things that we are looking to do moving forward and starting now is our Bank Black and Green campaign. And
Thanks.
Bank Black and Green is really trying to focus on creating an opportunity to highlight that there are Black-owned banks in the U.S., that we need to invest more in these places. And we also want to get them to signing on to a pledge to keep them from taking on fossil fuels and investing in that as a way to grow as a new model for how we can actually have generative financing that it's both a model for community investment, but also a model for investments that heal and help Mother Earth. And so we want to have, whether it's in working with, the EPA that now has the greenhouse gas reduction fund and using these banks as maybe like a go-between for some of those clean energy investments, getting more private investment in there and having not just a way to divest from fossil fuels, but a way to invest in the things that we know actually support clean energy, healthy economies, healthy living for the folks who live in these communities, and give them the chance and opportunity to be heard and respected in those spaces.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that history, because clearly these big banks have harmed people, not just because of fossil fuel investments, but because of redlining and predatory lending and subprime mortgage and everything that you said from slavery until now. So all the more reason that as Vanessa and Bill and you were talking to, move our money into institutions that really will invest in healthy communities. And so I know on your website, bankblackandgreen.com, which is up here on the slide, people can find banks that are Black owned, and many of them also do not invest in fossil fuels. And I wonder, in addition to this initiative, Hip Hop Caucus is, I believe, working on other kinds of clean energy policies and reforms. And I will say that Third Act also has a lot of resources for people to find better banks and credit unions and credit cards. So we list Bank Black and Green on our website as well. And there are other resources, Bank for Good and Bank.Green and others, where people can find greener credit cards, credit unions, and other institutions. But we have a couple more minutes. And so I was wondering if you wanted to share a bit more about some of the other kind of clean energy work that Hip Hop Caucus does.
Sure. So, and one thing I wanted to highlight as well is it's just because it's timely and relevant right now, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, which was a funder for a lot of clean energy opportunities and clean climate tech, is concerning. I mean, there's already been announcements that the groups that were invested in the bank are going to be protected, but it's just another signal of how smaller banks don't necessarily get the bailouts or funding, while large banks that are, again, contingent on their fossil fuel portfolios continue to get supported and elevated and eat up more of the share of funds from individuals and from businesses. And if the only way that we're going to really find financial freedom is making sure that we're looking out for ourselves and looking out for our own, and that's by investing in ourselves and our own communities and our own banks and credit unions as well. So I, as Third Act, definitely encourage folks to look into those options, look into those local areas, banks like Liberty Bank in New Orleans, Industrial Bank here in Washington, D.C., where I'm located. There are opportunities for that. And so in addition to looking at, what's happening and commenting in partnership with groups like Stop the Money Pipeline and others on some of these banks and their, their businesses and their annual general meetings where, all of these groups gather together. We just, there's Sarah Week just this past week in Houston, where all of these banks and fossil fuel titans came together to talk about clean energy. And we've been working on the ground with groups there in the Texas Gulf and the Louisiana Gulf to talk about, let's stop building out and exporting LNG and gas, and let's stop some of these facilities before they get built out that are, pumping out petrochemicals that are known to, cause carcinogens and harms, as we've seen in the news in East Palestine, just from that train derailment. And so we've been working with local groups, both in the Gulf South and the Ohio River Valley, and trying to elevate them too as part of our work to talk about these are the harms from these spaces and places. And we need to do more to identify what it is that local groups and communities want on the ground and to be investing in.
Awesome.
Yes,
well, that's exactly, I'm going to pivot back to you, Bill, because that's exactly what we want to do with our day of action, is to escalate against the big banks and to dry up the funding for all that bad stuff that you're talking about. So thank you, Russell, for sharing.
And what Russell was talking about Sarah Week in Houston, the sort of Davos of the oil industry that just happened last week, was also such a good reminder of what a global what a global thing this all is, because there were all kinds of people there from the Gulf South pushing hard, and there were also our great colleagues from Ukraine, Svetlana Romanko there, reminding people that it's the oil and gas industry that has funded Putin's war on civilians in the Ukraine. And these are the same banks that have been pumping money into Russian oil for 2 decades, even though it was very clear what Vladimir Putin was up to and who he was. So that kind of global solidarity, it's important for Americans to understand that if we're able to change the policy of these banks, it resonates here, but it also resonates all over the world. These are not the biggest banks in the US. These are the biggest banks on planet Earth. And their funding is what drives, Ben Jealous, the former head of the NAACP, has a great op-ed out today just saying there's a sense in which these banks are redlining the entire planet now, driving up the temperature of the earth, which is going to make it impossible to live in, vast swaths of Asia and Africa and North America too. So could not be more important what Russell is saying here, I think.
Yeah. So I think the question now is, how do we up the ante on these big, bad global redlining banks? And so we are wanting to up the ante with our National Day of Action coming on March 21st. And save the date, join us. We want to stop the banks funding fossil fuels. And one of our themes here is, we've got financial power. We are customers. We are concerned community members. And we're saying to the banks, if you don't cut it out on climate, we're going to cut up our credit cards. We're going to move our money. We're going to change our accounts. And so, Sophia, can you tee up that video? It's the second video. It's Jane Fonda. She's going to tell us a bit about this. Oops, but we can't hear the sound. We tested the other video initially and it worked, but this one...
Well,
I don't know.
It's good fun to get to look at Jane Fonda anyway.
It is.
I have voiceovers for Jane Fonda, but if you need, I'll jump in.
Well, we're gonna watch.
I filmed it with her, so I can
she
tell you
goes.
what she's saying. Since I filmed some of this with her, she's delivering a direct message to Jamie Dimon, the head of Chase, telling him that we're done, and many of those scenes right there, for instance, are outside the Chase Bank in Washington, D.C. And inside the Chase Bank on the other side of it was Russell's colleague, Reverend Yearwood, and me, and a few other people getting arrested in January of 2020, right before the pandemic started. That's when this big campaign, Deborah, was supposed to be underway. And Earth Day 2020 was going to have people inside and outside banks all over the country and so on. Then a little thing called COVID interfered with some of this planning. And so it's only now that we're back in the streets in quite this same way. But Tuesday is shaping up to be a remarkable day all across
and let's
the
show
country.
the map. Sophia, if you can pull the slide with the map up. So as Bill, you were saying, shaping up to be an amazing day. We've got more than 95 events in 28 states and Washington, D.C. And if Sophia can put in the chat, or I will try to do that, where you can find an event near you. So it's very exciting. Bill, do you want to give a little bit of flavor of what some of those events are going to involve?
Yes, it's hopefully will be a big, beautiful day. And there's going to be people inside and outside bank branches. And they're going to be delivering the same message everywhere that we need these banks to change, or we're going to change. We're going to try and make this connection to carbon and cash really powerfully. Some places where they've got, bank in a strip mall someplace and it just looks completely innocuous, people are going to be putting up 20-foot smokestacks next to the bank just to remind people that there's actually carbon pouring out of that bank, though you can't see it.
Sophia, you could actually show some of the other slides. We've got some photos. Thank you.
In Alaska, our colleagues are making big wooden credit cards and then going after them with chainsaws. The Great Alaska Chainsaw Credit Card Massacre. In Seattle, I think they've got a giant orca ready to eat credit cards one after another. I've seen lots of pictures of giant scissors appearing all over the country. And I'm going to be in Washington, D.C., and there, a whole bunch of us, including, I think, people from the Hip Hop Caucus and the executive director of the Sierra Club, Ben Jealous, and the new executive director of Greenpeace, Ebony Martin, and others we're going to be, there's a 24-hour vigil outside the banks and a march. And then people are going to, since many of us are old, going to sit down in 50 rocking chairs and blockade the entrances to the banks as we rock away there, and we'll see what happens. But the message is the same everywhere, that the time has come to change, and especially, as Russell points out, in the wake of this Silicon Valley bank failure, even more so, even more than a week ago, these four banks are now at the absolute center of our financial system. They're essentially quasi-governmental institutions now, because it's very clear that the federal government won't allow them to fail under any circumstances. And so if they're going to get that kind of privilege and everything that goes with it, we have to demand that they act responsibly in the face of the greatest crisis that humans have ever wandered into. And they're not doing that now, but they're quite capable of doing it. And the biggest point of these big demonstrations on Tuesday is just to start delivering that message to these banks relentlessly, that the time has come to change. And we'll see if we can do that. There will be lots of people cutting up their credit cards. I was just down at the college near here day before yesterday. They're going to be on break next week, so they held their demonstration a day early, and there were lots and lots of young people cutting up their credit cards. And people are going to be switching banks. And Russell's right. That's easier done now than ever before, because there are all these resources that people have to find Black-owned banks and green banks and whatever else. We're even hearing from business owners who have lots of money, who are figuring out that there are now tools to parcel up your spare cash, 250 grand at a time, to keep it below the federal insurance limits and get it out to good banks across the country, instead of pouring it into these money center banks.
Yeah.
So we're at a critical moment, and this is going to be should be a remarkably energizing day as people get to make this case.
Awesome. So Sophia, if you could just put that last slide up that says what you can do. Yeah, there are so many ways that folks can get involved. So as Bill was remarking, we've got events all over the country. You can join an event near you. But even if there's not one near you, there are several other ways you can get involved. You can sign the Banking on Our Future pledge. More than 17,000 have already signed the pledge, and more are coming every day. We're delivering those to the banks. You can write a letter to the banks. On Tuesday, we're also going to do some old school faxing of letters. Maybe the banks can ignore some emails, but we're going to jam their fax machines. So there'll be a link on our website about that. And you can, even if you can't go to an event, you could, hold a sign that links banks to climate impacts in your community, whether it's flooding in California or crazy snow or drought or heat or coral reef dying where you are. So you could take a selfie and share it on social media. We've got hashtags, and you can tag the banks. Hashtags like #StopDirtyBanks, #ActOnClimate. So all of these tools you can find on our website, thirdact.org/National Day of Action, and you can plug in that way to sign the pledge, take an action. There's a social media toolkit, there's graphics, there's all kinds of things. So please get involved. Use the calculator that Vanessa talked about earlier to estimate your own carbon impact and how switching can make a difference. And check out blackandgreen.com, and also on our website, other tools to help you find better credit cards. So lots of ways for you to make a difference. So that is pretty much our message today, is cash equals carbon, and we want the big banks to stop bankrolling the climate crisis.
And I think if we can add one more, that our cash is our carbon, and that in light of Silicon Valley Bank's awful collapse, bigger isn't better. I think the outcome of this tragedy for so many has been to gravitate towards large banks because they think big banks are better and safer. And the more they double down on increasing fossil fuels and our climate risk, the more they impact risk in every other way throughout the financial system. So not only is our own cash our own carbon responsibility, but we have to resend the message that bigger isn't better. So as you talk to your friends, I think that's the thing we need to make sure doesn't get entrenched from the last week of bank and financial system activities.
Russell, any last thoughts to share?
No, just thanks for all the listeners being on. I just want to plug that, Hip Hop Caucus, we will not only be present at the DC rally, but we'll have folks on the ground at some of the local rallies too, in North Carolina and also in California. So again, if folks get out there, sign up, Third Act. Also visit bankandblackandgreen.com, visit hiphopcaucus.org. Find out more ways that you can get involved with us and with this and with Third Act and partner organizations as well.
Fantastic work, everybody. Enormous thanks for being here today. And enormous thanks for gearing up for next Tuesday and then all that comes after. This is just the first part of this long ongoing fight. We're up against big boys, the capital in capitalism. But that doesn't mean that we can't make real shifts and make them maybe in time to really matter. So enormous thanks to everybody, and on we go.
On we go. Yes. Thank you to earthday.org for hosting us. And as Bill said, March 21st is an exclamation point. It's not an end point. So on we go to shareholder season and beyond. So see you in the streets on March 21st. And thank you for joining today.